The Temporal Forces metagame is quickly developing in Japan, and this should give us a good idea of what the Western metagame might look like in just a few weeks. This tier list ranks the decks based on how many points they've earned at City League events between March 2nd and March 4th, which includes 48 tournaments total. These are 64-player League Cup equivalent tournaments held in Japan. As we can see, Charizard Bibarel and Charizard Pidgeot combined have almost double the amount of the next highest archetype. However, when the two Charizard variants are split, Lost Zone Box becomes the #1 deck in terms of points earned. Other than that disclaimer, I think this tier list gives an accurate depiction of what to expect in terms of popularity, and somewhat accurate as well in terms of strength in the format. For example, Snorlax Stall as the 8th highest deck seems reasonable for predicting how popular it will be, but I actually think Snorlax is much better than 8th in terms of how good it is. One more thing to note is that tier 4 decks aren't necessarily bad decks, but they have earned less points than the 10 decks above them. Tier 4 should be seen as the worst of the best, not the best, but still considered to be a meta deck. If you want to build your standard format collection and open the newest packs, look no further than PokeCollect.com. PokeCollect is the best place to pre-order the newest set Temporal Forces for great prices and fast shipping. They also feature highly rated mystery box items exclusive to their website. Use code CELIO5 for 5% off at PokeCollect.com. You can find additional coupon codes and affiliate links in the description down below for PoTownStore.com, the best place to buy Pokemon TCG live code cards, Dragon Shield sleeves for my favorite TCG accessories in the game, and IntoTheAM.com for comfortable and passionate clothing. With that out of the way, we're going to look at least one deck list for each deck archetype on the tier list. Charizard Bibarel is one of two Charizard EX variants in Tier 1. Charizard closed out the Paradox Rift format comfortably in the top 3 decks, so with Giratina VSTAR and Gardevoir EX both losing important cards, Charizard stands to take the crown in the early days of post-rotation and Temporal Forces. New cards that will commonly be seen in Charizard Bibarel include Cryptomaniac's Deciphering, Buddy Poffin, and Prime Catcher. Cryptomaniac's Deciphering is a really strong supporter card that will allow you to specifically search for cards you want and then draw into them, giving this variant of the deck some of the search functionality that used to be exclusive to the Pidgeot EX variant. Buddy Poffin is simply a replacement for Battle VIP Pass. It can search for Charmander, Bidoof, Manaphy, Jirachi, and Skwovet, so it's extremely useful in Charizard Bibarel. Prime Catcher is probably the best A-Spec overall, and will be included in many decks for its powerful gust effect on an item with no additional costs or requirements. Cards to consider include Gouging Fire EX, Delphox V, and Maximum Belt. Gouging Fire EX offers a strong attack with no extra requirements, unlike Charizard EX's Burning Darkness that can be underwhelming in the early turns, especially if your opponent is purposefully not taking prize cards. Delphox V offers a similar utility as Gouging Fire, being a better attacker than Charizard in some early game situations, but instead of dealing a large amount of damage, Delphox's Magical Fire has the potential to KO 2 Pokemon at once. 120 damage is enough to KO pre-evolution Pokemon like Charmander, Ralts, or Frigibax, as well as popular evolved Pokemon like Bibarel and Cinccino. Maximum Belt can also help when your Charizard EX's Burning Darkness is underwhelming, since this will boost your damage output by 50 against EX Pokemon, enough to KO an opposing Chien Pal EX, Roaring Moon EX, or Iron Hands EX, even if your opponent hasn't taken a prize yet. Charizard Bibarel has been dominating the Japanese Temporal Forces format, but it's been surpassed by Lost Zone Box this weekend, while other decks like Chien Pal and Turbo Iron Hands are catching up as well. Charizard Bibarel is a very strong deck, but I expect Charizard Pidgeot to be the more popular and more successful variant in the West. Charizard Pidgeot is the second Charizard EX variant and is also in Tier 1 on this tier list. Charizard Pidgeot is more consistent and more aggressive than Charizard Bibarel, but at the cost of having 2 prize support Pokemon on the bench. With Path to the Peak rotated out of standard format, this deck full of powerful abilities might just go unchecked. Just like the Charizard Bibarel deck list, we'll see Prime Catcher and Buddy Poffin in this featured Charizard Pidgeot list. In addition, this is playing 1 Mist Energy, which protects the Pokemon it's attached to from effects of attacks like the effect of Giratina VSTAR Star Requiem, Roaring Moon EX's Frenzied Gouging, and Sableye Lost Mine. Cards to consider for this deck include Maximum Belt, Hero's Cape, and Professor Toro's Scenario. Maximum Belt solves the problem of Charizard EX's low damage output when the opponent hasn't taken prize cards yet. It can also help Charizard EX reach higher numbers in the mid to late game, like being able to one-shot an opposing Charizard EX when the opponent is at 2 prize cards remaining. Hero's Cape might be very strong in the upcoming format due to the lack of Lost Vacuum being played in lists. With limited options to remove tool cards, Hero's Cape can boost Charizard to a monstrous 430 HP, or even buff one of your bench sitters like Pidgeot EX or Rotom V to potentially avoid an easy KO. Speaking of avoiding KOs, Professor Toro's Scenario can be used in all sorts of situations to pick up a damaged Pokemon or remove liabilities from the board. Charizard EX is incredibly strong regardless of the specific variant. I have no doubt that at least one of the Charizard variants will be a top deck in the Western metagame. There aren't major differences between Bibarel and Pidgeot in terms of viability, but the Bibarel variant has consistently been more popular and more successful in Japan's post-rotation format. Lost Zone Box has been getting better and better results in Japan, reaching its best weekend of City Leagues yet, with more points than either Charizard variant. Iron Hands EX and Roaring Moon EX cover a lot of ground, and recent lists are including Hoopa EX, which is good against Arceus and opposing Iron Hands. New cards in this list include Prime Catcher, Buddy Buddy Poffin, and Emergency Board. Technical Machine Crisis Punch and Hoopa EX aren't brand new, but are two of the newer inclusions. Hoopa EX's Energy Crush can easily deal with fighting weak Pokemon, and uses Dark Energy, so it doesn't require an additional type of energy in the deck. Technical Machine Crisis Punch is typically going to be used by Cramorant, since the Lost Provisions ability makes Crisis Punch cost 0 energy. Cards to consider include Raikou V, Forest Seal Stone, and Iron Bundle. Raikou V offers a very efficient attack, as well as a V Pokemon to attach Forest Seal Stone to. Forest Seal Stone becomes a free card search when you have a V Pokemon to attach it to, and can also be used as a Lost Vacuum target to add more cards into the Lost Zone. The main use of Iron Bundle is to move an opposing Flutter Mane out of the active spot, but can generally be used whenever you'd like to switch the opponent's Pokemon. Lost Zone Box has the versatility and deck functionality to be a top contender in the upcoming format. Its performances recently in Japan have been quite impressive, and I expect it to continue this trend. While plenty of decks lost important cards to the rotation, Chien Baxcalibur is mostly unaffected, and might just be one of the best decks now. New cards in this list include Cypher Maniac's Code Breaking, Buddy Buddy Poffin, and Prime Catcher. Cypher Maniac is a strong new supporter card that allows you to search your deck for 2 cards and put them on top, which is incredible for a combo deck like Chien Pal. As long as you have a way to draw into the top 2 cards, like Bibarel, Greninja, Mew, or even Pokestop if the cards are items, Cypher Maniac quickly becomes search for any 2 cards. Prime Catcher is a huge upgrade for Chien Pal, making the Catcher canceling Cologne Moonlight Shuriken play easier than ever. Cards to consider include Kyogre and Palkia V and Palkia VSTAR. Kyogre offers the dynamic wave attack, which does 180 damage to one of your opponent's Pokemon at the cost of returning 3 water energy from Kyogre to your hand, which is actually a positive effect in this deck since you could just reattach the energy however you like with Baxcalibur's Super Cold next turn. Palkia VSTAR has been making its way into some Chien Pal lists for its efficient damage output, bulky health compared to the rest of the deck, and it offers a backup plan for energy acceleration if you whiff the turn 2 Baxcalibur. Chien Pal Baxcalibur is definitely one of the decks to play or prepare to play against in the upcoming format. With the ability to one-shot anything and the new power of Prime Catcher to more consistently achieve combos, this deck has the potential to be an unstoppable force if it gets off the ground. The Future Box archetype hasn't exactly panned out the way many were hoping it would. In fact, the most successful Future deck is much less a Future Box and more Iron Hands plus a couple of friends. With Peony Miraidon no longer intact due to the rotation, I believe this deck will at least try to replace it as the premier turbo archetype in the format. New cards in this deck include Iron Crown EX, Miraidon, Prime Catcher, and Heavy Baton. Iron Crown EX boosts your future Pokemon's attacks by 20 damage, which means Iron Hands can deal 200 damage with Ambu Very Much, with 3 Iron Crowns and a Future Booster Energy Capsule. Iron Crown will also buff the new Miraidon, which will be used to poke damage and accelerate energies to Iron Hands, relieving some of the pressure on electric generators. Heavy Baton almost reads as an unusable bulk card since it requires the Pokemon it's attached to have exactly 4 retreat cost, but Iron Hands EX fits that requirement, making this the perfect way to conserve energies on the board. A new card not included in the sample list is Reboot Pod, the new future A-Spec card. Prime Catcher is played over Reboot Pod since Reboot Pod can't power up one Pokemon all the way, which is what I find this deck needs most of the time. Prime Catcher ends up being a stronger card to see at most points in the game. Cards to consider include Mew EX, Iron Boulder EX, and Iron Bundle. Mew EX is borderline staple to the deck in my opinion, since none of the future Pokemon have effects that draw or search for cards. Gift Energy is great, but I'd rather not solely rely on Gift Energy for onboard draw support. Iron Boulder EX has popped up in some Japanese deck lists along with a single Fighting Energy to make use of its Repulsor Axe attack. With a Future Booster Energy Capsule and 3 Iron Crown EX on the board, this attack will do 140 damage, which is 280 against fighting weak Pokemon like Arceus VSTAR. The additional effect, which deals 8 damage counters, can definitely come up if Repulsor Axe leaves a defending Pokemon with 80 or less HP, but typically I'd expect them to be able to gust around Iron Boulder. Lastly, Iron Bundle can be a big help to move your opponent's tanky Pokemon like Charizard EX to the bench in favor of a weaker Pokemon, which Iron Hands can knock out with Thank You Very Much. I'm currently not impressed with this deck, but I was also not impressed with Paradox Rift format Miraidon, and we saw that deck rack up plenty of accomplishments. Turbo Hands is a fragile deck that can be completely shut down by a well-timed Lost Vacuum to remove Heavy Baton, or a Temple of Sinnoh to turn off Gift Energy. While it will absolutely be able to run away with games thanks to an early Amp You Very Much, I don't consider it to be one of the best decks available in this format. At the bottom of Tier 2 is Lugia Archeops, which won the recent Champions League in Japan. This deck has been revitalized by the new Cinccino, which does 70 damage for each special energy card attached to it. This seems to be one of the absolute best single prize attackers in the format, so every EX or V-Star based deck should consider their best way to handle this new threat. The new cards in Lugia are Cinccino, Mist Energy, and Master Ball. As previously stated, Cinccino does a ridiculous amount of damage thanks to Archeops' Primal Turbo ability. It only has 110 HP, which means other single prizers like Cramorant and Sableye will be able to deal with it easily, so in those matchups, your Lugia and Snorlax remain as the ideal attackers. Mist Energy is included to negate attacks like Star Requiem and Frenzied Gouging, which would instantly KO Lugia VSTAR. With Mist Energy to avoid Star Requiem and V-Guard Energy to reduce damage done by V Pokemon by 30, Giratina VSTAR will not be able to one-shot a Lugia VSTAR unless they put Temple of Sinnoh into play. Master Ball is simply the best ace spec for Lugia, since the most important part of the game for this deck is getting turn 2 Summoning Star to put 2 Archeops into play. Cards to consider include Squawkabilly EX, Mew EX, and Charon's Care. Squawkabilly EX offers one of the best ways to draw cards early in the game, however it does take up a bench spot, which is likely why we're not seeing this as a mainstream inclusion in Lugia lists. Similarly, Mew EX offers card draw and a strong attack, but might just not be worth the bench space when you need to reserve at least 3 spots for Lugia and 2 Archeops. Charon's Care can be good to pick up a damaged Lugia, but Collapse Stadium can offer a similar utility without the use of your supporter for turn. Lugia is very much on the map for the post-rotation format with its win at the recent Champions League. The pure aggression this deck offers with Cinccino is quite scary, but Lugia always runs the risk of being too linear, which allows players to formulate counter strategies ahead of time. Arceus Giratina lost Path to the Peak in rotation, so you might have thought this deck was gone. Arcetina had 2 placements in top 8 at the recent Champions League and has had several first place finishes in City League events. Let's look at how this deck is staying relevant in the new format. New cards in Arceus Giratina include Iron Leaves EX, Maximum Belt, and Eri. All 3 of these new cards are extremely good for the deck. Iron Leaves EX offers an easy way to one-shot opposing Charizards, so you'll see that deck lists have adjusted to play more Grass Energy than Psychic Energy due to the inclusion of Iron Leaves. Maximum Belt allows Arceus VSTAR to one-shot basic EX Pokemon like Chien EX, Roaring Moon EX, and Iron Hands EX. And Eri is a new supporter card that can sometimes replace the early Judge Path combination Arcetina became iconic for in previous formats. Against some decks, you will choose to use Eri early on, since this can stop an opponent's strong turn 2 by getting rid of strong items like Ultra Ball and Rare Candy. Cards to consider include Charon's Care, Grabber, and Pokemon League Headquarters. Charin's Care or Professor Tora's scenario will commonly be seen in Arctina. Charin's Care only works for Arceus, but it conserves the energy cards attached, whereas Tauros can be used to pick up any Pokemon, but it discards energies and tools attached to it. Grabber is interesting, especially in the same deck as Eri. This way you can sometimes play Grabber to evaluate your opponent's hand, and then decide if you'd rather use Eri or Judge. Pokemon League headquarters can make things harder for basic Pokemon-focused decks, especially since stadiums and Lost Vacuums are at an all-time low due to Path to the Peak rotating out. On paper, I'm very impressed with Arceus Giratina and the new tools available for it in Temporal Forces. However, in actual gameplay, the deck still feels clunky and somewhat predictable, so its placement on today's tier list is pretty fair. Next is Lost Zone Giratina, another archetype that lost Path to the Peak in rotation, but will likely be fine without it. Giratina was revered as one of, if not the best deck in format prior to the rotation, so it'll be interesting to see where it goes from here. The list we're looking at today comes from top 16 of the recent Champions League, which was a massive event, so it looks like Tina is doing just fine. New cards include Iron Leaves EX, Prime Catcher, Buddy Buddy Poffin, and Emergency Board. Iron Leaves EX somewhat makes up for the loss of Path to the Peak, since Path was a key piece of this deck's Charizard matchup, and now Iron Leaves EX will replace that with a more aggressive option. Prime Catcher should be incredible for this deck, allowing you to Roxanne and Gus in the same turn, even when you're not behind on prize cards. Cards to consider include Iron Bundle and Temple of Sinnoh. Iron Bundle can specifically be used to move opposing Flutter Mains out of the active, so you can use flower selecting. Temple of Sinnoh is essentially a counter to the counter, turning off opposing mist energies, so you can use Star Requiem for an instant KO. Decks do not often go from S tier to unplayable, so I'm expecting to still see great things from Lost Zone Giratina in this format. Lost Zone Giratina could potentially see a lot of play by top players, since it still keeps a pretty workable matchup spread across the board, with an especially good matchup against Snorlax Stall, which is sizing up to be a very strong contender. Speaking of, Snorlax Stall is the next deck on the tier list. I had already anticipated Snorlax being strong in post-rotation due to some of the new cards available and also because of Charizard's popularity, but I don't think anyone could have predicted 3 Snorlax to make it into top 16 of the recent Champions League event, a best of one major event with over 2,600 players. New cards for Snorlax include Eri and Hero's Cape. Eri almost seems like it was made for this deck. The number 1 card your opponent needs against this deck is Switch or Switch Cart, and Eri allows you to take it away from them. Notably, Eri can also discard Prime Catcher, which is going to be another popular out to Snorlax's block ability. Hero's Cape is the best A-spec for Snorlax, since it was already utilizing Luxurious Cape previously, and Hero's Cape is an upgrade from that. Cards to consider include Mantine, Giacomo, and Noivern EX. Mantine is simply a replacement for Echoing Horn, which rotates out of Standard. Giacomo becomes relevant with Lugia's Resurgence, since running them out of energies will be one of the win cons against this deck. Noivern EX, when paired with Mist Energy, can completely wall out decks like Lost Zone Box, Ancient Box, and Future Box. Covert Flight protects it from all damage done by basic Pokemon, and Mist Energy protects it from effects of attacks like Roaring Moon EX's Frenzied Gouging or Sableye's Lost Mine. I expect Snorlax to be a top deck in the Temporal Forces format. If Charizard is as popular in the West as it is in Japan, there's going to be a lot of free matchups around the room for stall decks. Debuting with a 9th place finish at Champions League Fukuoka, this deck features a lineup of new single prize Ancient Pokemon. Ancient Box offers multiple attackers and even disruption in the form of Flutter Mane and potential to mill your opponent's deck with Great Tusk. Underwhelming damage output, especially against V-Star Pokemon and high HP Pokemon like Charizard EX, is the main concern that this deck needs to address. Most of the key cards in this deck are new from Temporal Forces, including Roaring Moon, Koraidon, Flutter Mane, and Great Tusk. Roaring Moon's Vengeful Feathers and Koraidon's Primeval Battering act as the main attacks for this deck. Flutter Mane's Midnight Fluttering is mainly used to shut off Comfey's flower selecting ability, but can be annoying for other cards with abilities used in the active as well, like Chien Pal EX and Gholdengo EX. Great Tusk's Crust Collapse can steal a game if your opponent wears their deck down too thin, which might happen more than you'd expect since this archetype forces your opponent through a pretty long game of knocking out 6 single prize Pokemon. Cards to consider include Cobalion, Slitherwing, and Roaring Moon EX. Cobalion is included in some Ancient Box deck lists to boost your damage output against Charizard EX. Slitherwing is a good choice to cover fighting type weakness, since Koraidon is dragon type, and you'll want to clear opposing Iron Hands EXs off the board straight away. Roaring Moon EX fixes this deck's low damage output problem, but does add a multi-prize Pokemon to your otherwise single prize focused deck. I think Ancient Box is a solid and functional deck, but it is fairly linear and will struggle against decks with high HP and or healing capabilities. Roaring Moon EX decks will likely combine with Ancient Box, since we're not seeing a lot of Roaring Moon EX focused decks from Japanese events. Arceus decks, aside from Arctina, also stand to have a place in this format, like Arceus Alolan Vulpix VSTAR, which placed second at Champions League Fukuoka. Arceus Alolan Vulpix VSTAR is an anti-meta deck, using Alolan Vulpix VSTAR's Snow Mirage attack to wall out any attacking Pokemon which have abilities. This can single-handedly stop Charizard EX decks in their tracks, since Charizard EX, Pidgeot EX, and Radiant Charizard all have abilities and will not be able to damage Alolan Vulpix VSTAR. On the other hand, Alolan Vulpix VSTAR quickly becomes an awful card if your opponent's deck is equipped with attackers which do not have abilities, like Gouging Fire EX, Giratina VSTAR, Roaring Moon EX, and Chinchino. For this reason, it may be smarter to play Hisuian Goodra VSTAR as your main partner, and a thin line of Alolan Vulpix VSTAR for decks without applicable counters. Some combination of Hisuian Goodra VSTAR and Alolan Vulpix VSTAR looks like a good lineup to counter a wide field of decks and strategies. With an impressive second place out of over 2,600 players, I'm excited to see what anti-meta Arceus VSTAR decks can do at upcoming Western events. In Tier 4, we have 5 archetypes: Great Tusk Mill, Gholdengo EX, Gardevoir EX, Future Box, and Raging Bolt EX. I want to note here that these archetypes are all finding some success at Japanese City League events, just not as much success as the higher tiered archetypes. Great Tusk Mill will likely be in the shadows of Snorlax Stall, since both archetypes plan for an alternate win condition and try to trap the opponent's support Pokemon in the active position with high counts of gust effects. It is certainly different than Snorlax, and in my opinion easier and more fun to play, so we'll see some play from it, but it should be nowhere near as successful or popular as Snorlax focused decks. Gholdengo EX has a lot of similarities to Chien Baxcalibur in deck construction, with several overlapping cards, including Irida, Cypher Maniac's Code Breaking, Superior Energy Retrieval, Canceling Cologne, Prime Catcher, and Pokestop. In addition to this, both decks scale their damage with the number of basic energies discarded. It is likely that one of these archetypes will end up being superior, and right now my money is on Chien Baxcalibur, with my opinion being formed partially from tournament results and partially from my own testing. Without Shining Arcana, the Gardevoir archetype is a shell of its former self. The deck now relies on Drifloon and Screamtail as its main attackers, both of which greatly benefit from HP boosting tools like Luxurious Cape, Bravery Charm, and Hero's Cape. This strategy is very weak against Lost Vacuum, since your Pokemon will be knocked out if the tool was keeping them alive, and then your opponent will likely take another KO for the turn. However, the good news is that most archetypes are commonly including a 0 to 1 Lost Vacuum, so this strategy could realistically have a chance. Future Box differs from Turbo Iron Hands in that it plays at least 3 types of energy to support attacking with Miraidon, Iron Crown EX, Iron Hands EX, and Iron Leaves EX. The variety of attackers has fallen flat in comparison to Turbo Iron Hands, which almost entirely devotes its strategy to using Ampy very much, as early and often as possible. Raging Bolt EX has high HP and high damage potential, so it looks to have the makings of a good Pokemon card. This archetype looks like it would falter against single price strategies, which Lost Zone, Lugia, and Ancient Box are all very capable of presenting. Out of all the decks in today's tier list, this and Future Box are probably the least impressive by both statistics and my personal opinion. I hope you enjoyed today's breakdown of this tier list from PokekaBook.com, covering the 15 most successful archetypes from City League events. Be sure to subscribe to the channel for more Pokemon TCG content, and thanks for watching here on Celio's Network.